Sirens of phone alerts filled the glass office as the market bled red, and Ethan Cole stared at the plunging chart like a cliff edge calling his name. He clenched his jaw while Jordan Reyes whispered, "This can't be real." The narrator watched Ethan fight the urge to blink. Victoria Hale's legal notice landed in his inbox like a hammer, and she said, "Execute the clawback now." The narrator traced the tremor in Ethan's hand as he called the bank. A voice said, "Your credit line is suspended, pending review." The narrator noted the fluorescent lights turning cruel. Ethan muttered, "We have orders due Friday," while Jordan said vendors want cash today. The narrator felt the room shrink as screens flashed halted tickers. Maya Chen pinged, "There's a discrepancy in last quarter's receivables," and Ethan said, "How big?" The narrator held its breath as the figure filled the screen. Leonard Briggs called from a shadowed corner, and he said, "You grew faster than your float." The narrator heard silence thicken like wet cement, as alarms kept ringing. The narrator followed Ethan into the war room, where whiteboards were frantic math like bruises, and hope looked thin. Ethan said, "We promise next day delivery and cash in 5 twine." Jordan said, "The trucks will idle by noon without fuel." The narrator watched Maya slide a ledger across the table like a warning flare. She said, "Deferred revenue is masking burn, and R is fantasy." Ethan rubbed his temple as the lights hummed. Leonard said, "Cash buys time, not salvation." The narrator traced the map of vendors pinned with colored tags. Ethan said, "Call Adrian Wolf, he respects growth." Jordan said, "He respects collateral." The narrator listened to the clock, cut the air into smaller chances. Maya said, "We need transparency before we need capital." Ethan exhaled and said, "We do both today." The narrator felt the room commit to a path that might not forgive them. The narrator set the scene in a minimalist coffee bar where Ethan waited for a call like a verdict. He said, "Adrian, we can restructure terms." The line held a silence that felt priced. Adrian Wolf said, "Terms follow truth, not tempo." The narrator watched steam rise from a cup as if counting seconds. Ethan said, "Momentum is still ours if we bridge this week." Adrian said, "Your receivables are smoke, and lenders smell fire." The narrator noted the steady clink of porcelain as patrons laughed at safer problems. Ethan said, "We can pledge inventory." Adrian said, "Appraise it first and call me." The narrator felt the call end before the tone arrived. Ethan's shoulders sagged while his eyes stayed defiant. The narrator marked the moment when pride gave room to survival. The narrator opened the freight floor where pallets stood like unpaid promises, and forklifts slept hungry. Jordan said, "Drivers want cash on pickup." Ethan said, "Release half with alias for the rest." The narrator watched a dispatcher shake his head without words. Maya said, "Alias won't move diesel." The narrator tracked Ethan's gaze to a banner that bragged about record growth. He said, "We scaled the front and starved the spine." Leonard said, "Growth is a liar when it doesn't pay its bills." The narrator captured the smell of cardboard and cold metal. Ethan said, "Cut same-day lanes to keep ground moving." Jordan said, "Customers will erupt." The narrator heard the printer spit cancellation notices like rain. The narrator placed Ethan at the boardroom table under a chandelier that felt heavier than the death. Victoria Hale said, "Your covenants are broken, and the cure period is over." The narrator felt the air sharpen. Ethan said, "We can negotiate a standstill." She said, "Bring cash or resign voting control." The narrator watched Jordan stiffen while Maya typed furiously. Leonard said, "Control without cash is theater." The narrator saw Ethan weigh power against payroll. He said, 48 hours to prove solvency. Victoria said, 24, or we exercise remedies. The narrator heard the word remedies echo like a closing door. Ethan nodded once, not in surrender but in focus. The narrator ended the meeting with the scrape of a chair and a plan born of necessity. The narrator found Ethan Cole awake before sunrise, pacing a small kitchen where unpaid bills curled at the edges like leaves. He said, I built speed because time felt like debt. The narrator lingered on a faded notebook labeled First Orders, stained with coffee and hope. Ethan said, we chased every zip code and forgot the gas. The narrator watched him open an email from a customer who wrote about a late medical shipment. He said, I will make this right. The narrator traced the route of promises from his first van to high-rise leases. Leonard Briggs texted, pride is a mortgage. Ethan said, I know. The narrator felt the room hold its breath as dawn thinned the dark. Jordan Reyes pinged, drivers need answers by 9. Ethan said, they get answers first. The narrator listened to the kettle click off like a small decision becoming a larger one. The narrator moved with Ethan into the bullpen, where a dozen screens hummed like restless bees and morale felt rented. Ethan said, we grew faster than our systems. And that is on me. The narrator watched Jordan Reyes stand straighter as if catching a falling box. Jordan said, we can stabilize lanes if we face the truth. Maya Chen said, we disclose receivable risks now, not later. The narrator tallied heads, nodding with fear and loyalty in equal shares. Ethan said, payroll comes before pride. Leonard Briggs said, courage pays better dividends than spin. The narrator saw a driver at the door holding a wrinkled repair bill like a plea. Ethan said, we cover safety today. The narrator felt the room warm by a degree as people returned to work with smaller steps and larger purpose. The narrator followed Ethan to a storage bay that smelled of rubber and rain, where his first delivery van sat like a relic of hunger. He said, this ugly thing made the first 100 runs. The narrator traced chipped paint that mapped his early routes. Jordan Reyes said, you taught me to scan every crate like it held a life. The narrator watched Ethan rest his palm on the hood, as if taking a pulse. He said, speed without reserves was vanity. Maya Chen said, numbers warned us and we blinked. The narrator noted a handmade sticker that read promise fast, promise true. Ethan said, we will earn that again. The narrator heard thunder roll over the roof like a countdown. Leonard Briggs said, reserves start with hard calls. Ethan said, then we start calling. The narrator set Ethan and Leonard in a corner booth at a diner where the coffee tasted honest and the rain turned to mist. Leonard Briggs said, I once levered earnings until the floor gave way. The narrator watched a scar of memory cross his eyes. Ethan said, did you ignore the alarms? Leonard said, I tuned them to a quieter key. The narrator felt the lesson arrive like a bill you cannot contest. Ethan said, teach me the discipline to shrink. Leonard said, cut unprofitable lanes, sell excess, and cash the ego. The narrator heard plates clatter like gavel knocks. Ethan said, we call Adrian Wolf with a concrete plan, not a plea. Leonard said, and you tell your people the whole storm. The narrator saw resolve settle like a coat on Ethan's shoulders. The narrator brought the team into a glass conference room where the city lights waited like witnesses. Ethan said, we cut same day in 5 low-margin corridors tonight. The narrator watched Jordan wince and then nod. Jordan Reyes said, I will call the shippers myself. Maya Chen said, we sell the idle scanners and the spare racking. The narrator tracked a spreadsheet turning red rose to gray as assets found buyers. Ethan said, we brief staff on risks and we name everyone. Leonard Briggs said, truth buys patience. The narrator felt the meeting turn from fear to craft. Ethan said, I call Adrian Wolf with collateral and a cash map. Maya said, and we publish a vendor payment calendar. The narrator closed the scene on a whiteboard where the word survive became plan. The narrator opened on a gray morning where Ethan Cole reviewed a vendor ledger that read like a storm log and every line felt personal. He said, we start with the oldest pain and pay forward. Jordan Reyes said, 3 carriers issued stop notices. The narrator watched Maya Chen circle unexplained credits that moved like shells in a street game. She said, "These offsets are backdated without support." The narrator felt the office hold its breath as Leonard Briggs scanned silently. He said, "Someone is hiding float inside timing tricks." The narrator traced Ethan's gaze to a locked folder marked Reconciliations. Ethan said, "We request audit trails and revoke access." The narrator recorded the moment resolve overtook worry. Jordan said, "Drivers will walk if we miss Friday." The narrator heard a distant horn and knew time was already moving. The narrator followed Ethan into a glass huddle where Victoria Hale appeared on screen with a composure that could cut metal. She said, "Send a 12-week cash plan by noon." The narrator saw Ethan nod without blinking. He said, "We have verified collateral and asset sale dates." Victoria said, "Show contracted purchase orders, not hopes." The narrator watched Maya drag files into a shared drive like sandbags before a flood. Jordan said, "We can promise uptime with fewer lanes." The narrator noted how Victoria's smile never touched her eyes. She said, "Promises mature when invoices do." Leonard said, "Then we accelerate collections with discounts." The narrator felt the call end with a chime that sounded like a gavel. Ethan said, "We meet noon with proof, not posture." The narrator set Ethan and Maya in a records room where dust motes hung like suspended doubts and a server rack hummed a warning. Maya Chen said, "A user named NightShift edited receivables at 2 a.m. The narrator watched Ethan's eyes tighten. He said, "NightShift is deactivated." The narrator felt the timeline expand as logs scrolled and red flags bloomed. Maya said, "Edits lowered reserves and raised revenue." The narrator traced a pattern that matched the quarter the bank praised. Ethan said, "Find who owned that alias." The narrator heard wires sing with the weight of buried truth. Maya said, "Credentials were granted by admin last fall." The narrator saw a door in Ethan's memory open onto a meeting they had rushed and never questioned. The narrator carried Ethan to the loading dock where drivers gathered in jackets that smelled of rain and deadlines. Ethan said, "Safety repairs clear today, fuel cards reload at 4. The narrator watched a veteran driver relax his shoulders by an inch. Jordan Reyes said, "We are pausing same day in 5 corridors to preserve ground." The narrator heard grumbles fade into wary silence. Ethan said, "Dispatch will call every shipper before the change." The narrator saw leadership arrive as actions rather than speeches. And Maya Chen said, "Payment calendar posts tonight." The narrator noted eyes soften when truth stood upright. Leonard Briggs said, "Short routes, full promises." The narrator felt the dock breathe like a machine learning its rhythm again. The narrator placed Ethan alone in his office as dusk bled into neon and a spreadsheet blinked like a metronome. He said, "Adrian needs proof, and the bank needs contrition." The narrator watched him assemble a deck that traded swagger for receipts. He said, "We show lanes cut, assets sold, and cash timing." The narrator saw a folder labeled NightShift sit like a loaded question. Ethan said, "We investigate without flinching." The narrator noted how his hands steadied as the plan found shape. Jordan Reyes texted, "Drivers thanked us for the call." The narrator felt a small victory thread through the larger deficit. Maya Chen wrote, "Logs ready for counsel." The narrator closed on Ethan, saving the deck and breathing like a runner who finally chose pace over sprint. The narrator opened in the boardroom, where silence weighed heavier than the rain outside. Ethan Cole said, "We found edits tied to an alias named NightShift." The narrator watched Victoria Hale arch a brow on the video wall. She said, "Aliases don't make fraud, people do." The narrator noted Maya Chen slide logs across the table like evidence on trial. Maya said, "These entries inflated revenue when covenants tightened." The narrator saw Leonard Briggs fold his hands and stare at Ethan. He said, "NightShift was sanctioned by someone inside your trust circle." The narrator marked the way Jordan Reyes leaned forward, eyes searching Ethan's face. Jordan said, "You think it was me?" The narrator heard tension fracture the air before Ethan spoke. He said, I think someone wanted us blind, and we must uncover who. The narrator carried Ethan into a law office where leather smelled like judgment and clocks ticked with precision. Counsel read logs line by line, brows furrowed. Maya Chen said, credentials were granted last fall by system admin. The narrator noted Ethan. Grip his pen like a weapon. He said. Admin reported to Jordan. Jordan Reyes said, I never signed those rights. The narrator saw a lawyer raise a hand. He said, prove chain of authority with time-stamped approvals. The narrator felt the room grow smaller as Ethan recalled a night when trust outweighed protocol. Leonard Briggs said, shortcuts are invisible until they break you. The narrator watched Ethan close his eyes, the weight of oversight pressing like a stone. The narrator set Ethan in a rooftop garage at twilight, where Adrian Wolfe arrived in a black sedan, calm as a storm contained. Adrian said, your numbers tell me lies, but your cuts show me truth. The narrator watched Ethan stand straight, though the wind pulled at his coat. Ethan said, we trimmed corridors, sold racking, paid drivers. Adrian said, collateral speaks louder than words. The narrator saw him lift a file, contracts glinting under sodium light. Adrian said, I can bridge you, but control transfers to me if you falter again. The narrator noted Ethan's hesitation flash and fade. He said, I take the terms and prove solvency. The narrator mocked the handshake, as steel wrapped in velvet. The narrator brought Ethan back to headquarters where tension cut deeper than the fluorescent hum line. Jordan Reyes said, you signed with Adrian, didn't you? Ethan said, we needed fuel to keep the fleet alive. The narrator saw Jordan's jaw set like stone. He said, control slips with every concession. Maya Chen said, but survival without terms is fantasy. The narrator noted Leonard Briggs lean against the wall, eyes tired but approving. He said, sometimes you sell a piece to save the frame. The narrator captured Ethan's silence, heavy with cost. He said, I keep steering, even if Adrian holds the wheel. The narrator closed the act in Ethan's dim apartment, where receipts and contracts covered the table like a battlefield map. Ethan said, Adrian owns a lever, but I hold the plan. The narrator noted his eyes drawn to the folder, marked NightShift. Maya's message blinked on his phone. She said, the alias trails back to finance admin under Victoria's authority. The narrator felt his chest tighten as betrayal stepped closer. Leonard Briggs left a voicemail that said, truth can break harder than debt, but it also frees. The narrator saw Ethan lean back, resolve washing over fatigue. He said, then we expose it, no matter who stands burned. The narrator opened on Ethan Cole before dawn, staring at a financial deck lit in cold blue, while thunder rolled outside. He said, today we confront wolves in suits and shadows in ledgers. The narrator noted Jordan Reyes paced the room, fists tightening. Jordan said, if Victoria Hale planted NightShift, she will turn this back on us. The narrator saw Maya Chen, align binders of proof like armor. She said, logs are time-stamped, and admin chains link to her. The narrator marked Leonard Briggs leaning by the window, voice worn but steady. He said, expose her clean, or she'll claim you're the fraud. The narrator watched Ethan's reflection in glass, torn between pride and survival. He said, we gamble everything on truth. The narrator set Ethan in the shareholder hall where lights burned hot and whispers buzzed like hornets. Victoria Hale said, Cole's empire is insolvent by its own admission. The narrator heard murmurs spread. Ethan Cole said our revenue was falsified by credentials issued under Hale's authority. The narrator watched Maya Chen display logs on a screen, each line a nail. Jordan Reyes said, drivers and vendors stand paid because we face the numbers. The narrator noted Victoria's lips curl, her voice calm but dangerous. She said, blame does not restore confidence. The narrator saw Adrian Wolfe step from the shadows, file in hand. He said, confidence follows collateral, and I hold both. The narrator felt the hall tilt toward a verdict. The narrator carried Ethan into a side chamber where negotiations roared louder than the storm outside. Victoria Hale said, "Withdraw your claim, or I file for receivership." The narrator watched Ethan's hand press flat on the table. He said, "The fraud traces back to you, not me." The narrator marked Adrian Wolf circling, voice like silk over steel. Adrian said, "I can save either side, but only one." The narrator noted Jordan Reyes slam a fist. He said, "We will not sell truth for survival." Maya Chen said, "Evidence secures lenders, not threats." The narrator caught Leonard Briggs leaning close to Ethan, whispering, "This is your wager, son. Bet all or break." The narrator heard Ethan answer aloud. He said, "I bet on truth before ruin." The narrator opened on the climax where Ethan faced Victoria under the blaze of cameras. Reporters shouted, flashbulbs burst. Ethan said, "We disclose every ledger, every invoice, every driver paid." The narrator noted Jordan Reyes lift boxes of files like proof carved in paper. Maya Chen said, "Logs show tampering tied to Hale's admin key." The narrator saw Victoria Hale smile thinly, her power trembling. She said, "Truth without control is worthless." The narrator marked Adrian Wolf raise a hand, his voice carrying. He said, "Control shifts today to the one who owns proof and collateral." The narrator watched Leonard Briggs nod once, the weight of history in his gaze. Ethan said, "Then I own survival through truth, not spin." The narrator closed the act in silence where Ethan sat alone on a stairwell, tie loosened, storm gone but echoes loud. He said, "We wagered all and left blood on the floor." The narrator noted Jordan Reyes appear, voice soft. He said, "The drivers back you now, not the numbers." The narrator saw Maya Chen sit beside Ethan, glasses off, exhaustion plain. She said the truth held. The narrator marked Leonard Briggs descend slowly, resting his hand on Ethan's shoulder. He said, "You stood where I once fell." The narrator ended as Adrian Wolf's text buzzed, funding secured, control deferred. Ethan said, "Then the gamble lives another day." The narrator returned at sunrise as bank wires cleared and a thin hope lit the screens. Ethan Cole said, "Vendors first, then fuel, then payroll." The narrator watched a payment calendar publish like a weather report that finally promised sun. Jordan Reyes said, "Dispatch confirms trimmed lanes hold." The narrator felt the room loosen without losing focus. Maya Chen said, "Collections accelerate with early pay discounts." And the narrator saw small balances vanish like pebbles rolled downhill. Leonard Briggs said, "Cash discipline is a muscle, not a memo." The narrator marked Ethan send a note to every driver that read, "We see you." Ethan said, "Transparency stays even when the storm leaves." The narrator heard keyboards answer like steady rain turning into rhythm. The narrator entered a compliance suite where regulators waited with cool eyes and warm printers. Victoria Hale said, "I authorized access for speed, not deceit." The narrator watched counsel stack exhibits until excuses ran out of table. Maya Chen said, "NightShift entries coincide with covenant tests." The narrator noted timestamps, hammering like a gavel. Ethan Cole said, "We disclose, we remediate, we move." The narrator felt a signature, end a chapter that had bled margins and trust. Victoria said, "You will not outrun scrutiny." The narrator heard Adrian Wolf answer from the doorway. Adrian said, "Scrutiny funds discipline when numbers are honest." The narrator marked the exit, quiet and final, like a door closing on an echo. The narrator followed the team through a warehouse they would sell, where echoes counted the cost of rescue. Jordan Reyes said, "We trained crews to hand off these lanes clean." The narrator watched stickers mark racks like surgical lines. Ethan Cole said, "We keep the spine, lose the excess." The narrator felt pride and grief share a bench like old rivals. Maya Chen said, "Sublease signed, proceeds hit Friday." The narrator saw drivers shake hands with new owners and keep their roots. Leonard Briggs said, You measure leadership by what you release, not what you hoard. The narrator tracked a final inventory scan beep like a heartbeat that knew its pace. Ethan said, "Thank you for building this with me." The narrator let the shutter door fall with a soft finality. The narrator set night on the loading dock where diesels smelled like continuity and radios spoke in measured beats. Jordan Reyes said, "Hit rate is 97 on ground, 0 misses on medkits." The narrator watched smiles appear like shy lanterns. Ethan Cole said, "We trade scale for reliability, and we keep that trade." The narrator felt fatigue turn into craft. Maya Chen said, "Cash cushion equals 3 weeks by next Tuesday." The narrator saw a driver lift 2 fingers in thanks as a fuel card beeped green. Leonard Briggs said, "This is not glory, it is practice." The narrator marked the moment a company recognized itself again. Ethan said, "Tomorrow we publish our playbook." The narrator knew the storm had taught a language they would not forget. The narrator closed on a quiet office where dawn traced silver lines across reports that finally reconciled. Ethan Cole said, "We live smaller and steadier, and we earn every mile." The narrator watched him sign a policy that banned shortcuts, dressed as brilliance. Maya Chen said, "Monthly audits, daily cash reads, and plain language." The narrator saw Jordan Reyes pin a map with fewer lanes and clearer promises. Leonard Briggs said, "You are not who you were at the top, and that is the point." The narrator felt the weight of survival become a responsibility rather than a shield. Ethan said, "Call the customer with the medical kits and ask how we can do better." The narrator ended on a desk where the word growth meant endurance, not velocity. The narrator opened in a modest press room where cameras hummed and the storm of speculation waited. Ethan Cole said, "We grew too fast, we stumbled, but we chose transparency over collapse." The narrator watched Jordan Reyes stand beside him, eyes steady. Jordan said, "Our drivers, our partners, they deserve truth before profit." The narrator mocked Maya Chen, showing reconciled ledgers like open doors. She said, "The numbers speak now without disguise." The narrator saw Leonard Briggs in the back row, his face unreadable but proud. He said, "Correction is more lasting than momentum." The narrator captured the applause that was cautious but real, the kind given when trust begins to return. Ethan said, "We rise again, smaller, sharper, and honest." The narrator carried Ethan into a customer warehouse where the first reconciled shipments were being received. "Well," a manager said, "your kits arrived on time, complete and clean." The narrator noted relief wash over Ethan like a tide. Jordan Reyes said, "Ground routes held with 99% accuracy." Maya Chen said, "Collections improved with honesty." The narrator saw workers unload boxes with quiet efficiency, no whispers of doubt. Leonard Briggs said, "Trust earns compound interest." The narrator captured Ethan's handshake with the manager as more than logistics. It was a promise reborn. Ethan said, "We scale when trust scales, not before." The narrator opened a dim cafe corner where Ethan sat with Adrian Wolf, contracts closed and silence between them. Adrian said, "You survived without setting all control, rare in this city." The narrator saw Ethan's jaw ease for the first time in weeks. Ethan said, "We endured by trading speed for substance." Adrian said, "Control is never permanent, only rented with discipline." The narrator marked the exchange as not quite friendship, but mutual recognition. Ethan said, "We will repay your bridge and stand without your shadow." Adrian smiled faintly, sipping his coffee. The narrator ended on 2 men who measured survival differently, but shared respect for the cost. The narrator followed Ethan back to headquarters where walls once echoed panic, but now hummed with steadier rhythm. Jordan Reyes said, "Dispatch ran clean for 30 days straight." The narrator watched staff smile without forcing it. Maya Chen said, "Cash flow forecast holds steady through quarter." Leonard Briggs said, "What you built now will outlast what you lost." The narrator noted Ethan, gathered the team, his voice firm but lighter. Ethan said, We do not chase growth, we master service. The narrator marked the applause as gentle but strong, a pulse of survival turned into culture. The narrator closed the story at night on a rooftop, where the city breathed, and rain had finally cleared. Ethan Cole said, "We grew too fast and fell hard, but we chose the climb again with steadier hands." The narrator saw Jordan Reyes join him, silent but loyal. Maya Chen said softly, "Truth is our only collateral now." Leonard Briggs said, "Legacy is not in peaks, but in endurance." The narrator marked Ethan's gaze at neon lights, reflecting on wet streets, his face lined by lessons. He said, "We live slower, wiser, and we live." The narrator ended with silence that carried both loss and rebirth.